When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. All right. That's a strange statement. Is it not? What is its value at the face of it? Don't know the guy's name. The 2 verses give us a lot of information, but we don't know the guy's name. He doesn't say, well, I was there. I was nothing but a young man, kid. I didn't know any better, and I was out running around at night with a linen cloth wrapped around me, and I got too close to the action, and I said, whoa. And as I tried to leave, one of the guards grabbed my cloak, and I ran away naked. Why is that there? From time to time, writers will do that, and it's about who? Themselves. You ever watch Alfred Hitchcock movies? What's one of the famous things Alfred Hitchcock is famous for in his movies? A little cameo appearance. If you blink, you missed it. He puts his signature on his movie. There are a lot of scholars that believe that Mark just put his signature toward the end of his gospel, giving the readers a true life experience about who was there when it happened. Let's look at what it says. A young man, probably in Jewish terminology, at least 13 years old. I'm going to guess he was 15 or 16. See if it doesn't fit what the evidence we're given here. Say it's 15 or 16, a teenager. What are teenagers notorious for doing? Dumb stuff. They don't think through it. Rash. Going out on the edge, taking chances, seeking excitement, wanting to be where the action is, following around someone they're enamored with, being part of the crowd. Fits the picture here. He's wearing nothing but a linen garment. Two pieces there. It's early March. A little spring thaw has started. The sunshine is out. The breezes are balmy. The sky is blue. And it feels good to be outdoors. What do the teenagers start doing? They start taking off clothes. Especially the girls. What? Here it is, the 3rd day of March, and they're dressed like that? Tomorrow's going to be freezing. Teenagers don't like to wear their clothes. I don't think it's changed over 2,000 years. But he's wearing nothing but a linen garment. What does the word linen indicate? Wealth. Linen was a very expensive material. So if this teenage kid, if his mom entrusted him with a linen garment, they didn't go out running around at night with that linen garment, they had some money in the family. Money in the family. All right. Go ahead. He was following Jesus. He knew Jesus, or was curious about him. He may have known the disciples who were with Jesus. But the teenager, who was wealthy, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked. That's all he had on. Now, he could have had on a loincloth, I guess, and still be considered naked. I'm not sure. And I haven't read anybody else that was willing to discern whether or not he had any underwear on. But he was basically naked. Something a Jewish man would not do, given the choice. Leaving his garment behind. Teenagers. They lose their stuff, right? They lose their clothes. They lose the coat that mama bought them. They lose the shoes. Well, they may not lose their shoes. They have more to do with shoes. But the shirt, jacket. So it all points to a teenager. It points to a teenager from a wealthy family. It points to a teenager who knew Jesus. It points to a teenager who may have known the disciples as well, and he was part of the crowd that night when Jesus was arrested. All right, let's move ahead. Acts 12:12. And we're going to take that situation we just read about and modify it a little later. Acts 12:12. We'll expand on it. Here it comes. Acts 12:12. Are you there? Now this is a situation when Peter escaped, was rescued from jail by the angel. And when he left jail, he went to where the church or a group of Christians in Jerusalem had met to pray. So that's the scene here. When this had dawned on him, let's back up to 11. Then Peter came to him and said, now I know without a doubt that the Lord sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches. Herod was going to kill him, probably. Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were anticipating. Verse 12. When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. All right. Help her out, Tommy. Thank you. John Mark. When Peter was released from prison by the angel, he went to John Mark's house. The mother of John Mark. That means John Mark's dad was probably dead. But he was probably a wealthy Jew. He was probably, he could have been a wealthy Jew that moved in from wherever he made his fortune. Ephesus, Rome, Antioch, wherever. As many elderly Jews who had the money to do it were prone to do, they would move to Jerusalem, the holy city where the temple was, and they would spend out their last years near the temple in Jerusalem. They would marry younger women and have families, and they would leave behind widows with their money. They couldn't take it with them, so they had to leave it behind. So the picture here is of John Mark's mother, a widow, had a house that was big enough for the church to gather at, and had enough money to put a linen garment on her child, who was going to leave it in the garden. Yes, ma'am?
Why didn't he have education then?
Who didn't have education?
Mark.
Oh, he probably did have education, but it was Hebrew education. Aramaic, not Greek. Not Greek. He grew up in Jerusalem. They don't have any use for Greek. Now, his daddy might have spoken good Greek, but he could have died when John Mark was 2 years old. All right. So, there's also scholars who think that John Mark's mother's house was where the Last Supper was held. Fits. A room big enough to have a meal that big in an upper room would require someone who had some wealth. And here we've got another situation, instance, where that same house is being used for the church to meet in. Okay. Let's go ahead. 12:25. Acts 12:25. Just right across the page. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with him John, also called Mark. Now, what mission are we talking about? We're talking about the mission that happened after Paul's conversion. He went to Damascus. He spent 3 years in seminary there, studying the Old Testament, trying to figure out how in the world does the Old Testament and this Jesus match up. Spent 3 years figuring it out. He figured it out. So one of the things that and then he settled down in Syrian Antioch. There was a strong Christian work, strong church there that they were a part of. He was a part of. Barnabas was a part of it. Barnabas was whose cousin? John Mark. Barnabas and John Mark were cousins. So, at some point, while they were in Antioch, they decided they were going to take an offering back to the poor in Jerusalem, because you had a lot of widows. Lots and lots of widows. Remember all the people moving back? And they weren't all rich. They had lots of widows. There were Jewish widows and Greek widows. And there was a famine going on. And the church at Antioch was going to help out the church in Jerusalem. And Barnabas and Paul were going to be the bearers of the offering. So they took the offering down to Jerusalem, and they left it with the disciples there, the apostles. And when they went back to Antioch, they took John Mark with them. And that's what verse 25 says. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, that's the mission of the offering, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. Let's go ahead to Acts 13:5. Remember the first missionary journey? Barnabas and Paul and John Mark were commissioned to go on what was Paul's first missionary journey. Then along the way, for whatever reason, we don't know, we will never know unless some documents should turn up that give us enlightenment. John Mark turned away. All right, here we go. When they arrived, what's the verse I'm looking for? 5. When they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogue. John was with them as their helper. John Mark was with Paul and Barnabas as their helper. Moving along. Verse 13. Chapter 13, verse 13. From Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, that's up in Asia Minor, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. Paul got bent out of shape about that. He didn't like it at all. He didn't like, whatever the reason was, Paul was really, really torn up about Mark abandoning them. Look at Acts 13:40. Is that right? That doesn't look right. I'm looking for the second missionary journey. Okay. I've got to go further over. Anyway, I can't find it right now. I've got the wrong reference here. But when the second missionary journey, Paul decided, and Barnabas planned the second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to take Mark with him to forgive him. Said, the kid's got promise. We need to include him in these things and train him up so that he can be a valuable part of the work. Paul says, no, not going to do it. So there's an irrevocable split then there. It just wasn't going to stand. So John Mark and Barnabas went on their way. Paul and Silas went on their way. So with this fight that happened between them, you got 2 missionary teams going out now instead of just one. 1530. 1539. Thank you, John. 1539. Tells about the split between the 2. So now you got 2 missionary teams. So out of bad comes good. Out of sore feelings comes victorious results. All right, let's go ahead. Acts 13:40, we already did that. Colossians 4:10 through 11. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. General Electric Power Company. I remember that coming from Lindsay Savage. All right, I'll get there eventually. All right, Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, 11. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, 11. My fellow prisoner, here's the final greetings from Paul to the church at Colossae. And his final greeting says, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You know, there were a lot of Marks running around the Mediterranean area in that day. And right here, he gives us exactly which Mark it was, the cousin of Barnabas. So at some point then, before Paul wrote this letter to Colossae, he and Mark had made up. They're on the same team. He was in Rome at that time. Paul was in his first house arrest. Remember, he took an offering back to Jerusalem from the churches in Thessalonica, in that area. And he was arrested there, spent 2 years in prison, about another year in transit, and wound up in Rome under house arrest because he had appealed to Caesar. And he wrote Colossians while he was under house arrest. So Mark then was in Rome with Paul around 50 AD. 20 years after he had left his linen garment in the garden. Grown up a bit. Grown up a bit, no doubt. All right, let's go ahead to the next one. Philemon. Philemon. Over at the end of Paul's letters. One chapter book, so Philemon 24. Philemon, which was also written about AD 60. Verse 24 says, and so do Mark. Send you greetings. So Mark is still in Rome with Paul around 60 AD. Look at 1 Peter, verse 5. So we're going to go toward the back past Hebrews, past James, and we get to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. This is Peter writing. He says, she who is in Babylon often was a code word for Rome. We assume that's the way it is here. She who is in Rome, she meaning the church. The church that is in Rome. That's the way it has been translated by many. The church that is in Rome, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark. Now, Peter wrote this letter, and most think he did. Then Mark was not only in Rome with Paul, Mark was in Rome with Peter. Around 64 AD. Now there is no there is no solid proof that Peter was in Rome. It just ain't there. You can put it together by circumstantial evidence. Peter may have written from somewhere else, but this wording here, if it was Peter that wrote this book, he was in Rome when Mark was in Rome. Now, why is that important? That is important because it is believed by most scholars, and I got some evidence to show you that one of the early church historians thought that Mark got his information from Peter to write his gospel. See, Mark was not one of the apostles. He was probably only about, he could have been as young as 10 or a little older when Jesus was in the thick of his ministry, his 3-year ministry. So Mark couldn't have been a part of that. He was too young. So he would have had to get his information from someone else. And because he was supposedly with Peter in Rome about the time that this book, Mark, would have been written, then the thing is that he probably got it from Peter. All right, let's see, a couple more here. 2 Timothy 4:11. We're going to back up here, get back into Paul's letters. Now, 1 Timothy was written from the house arrest of Paul, his first imprisonment in Rome. 2 Timothy was written from the Mamertine dungeon during his second imprisonment under Nero. So 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. Again, this is personal remarks and greetings before he closes out the book. 2 Timothy 4:11. Paul writes, only Luke is with me. Now he's writing to Timothy, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry. Now, it is believed that Paul was executed just before Nero's death. And that would have been in 67 or 68. So that places, if Timothy did get Mark and bring him to Rome as Paul requested, then that means that Mark was also in Rome again at 67 or 68. Now, the earlier time period, in the earlier 60s, is favored by some scholars for Mark being in Rome and writing his gospel. The latter time period, 67, 68, is favored by other scholars. In fact, I've got two guys I'm using as my main commentaries. One I believe is the earlier date, 60 to 64, and the other one believes the latter date is the time that Mark was in Rome and wrote the gospel. All right, we're almost done here. Look at Mark 15:21. You will remember this, even though you probably can't quote it, just me giving you the scripture reference. Mark 15:21. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, hang on to that, Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Typically condemned prisoners who are condemned to crucifixion they were required to carry their cross weighing 30 or 40 pounds to the place of execution. Jesus started out carrying it, but because of the lashing, the terrible flogging he had received, his strength just gave out. So when it happened, they called on this Simon. Mark puts in that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why would you put that information in a letter? Huh?
Distinguish who he was.
Well, maybe. If I'm telling a story about First Baptist Church of Charlottesville, and I pick out two, and I pick out two persons, and I mention them in the story, I need to have a reason for doing that. Mark is writing supposedly to the church in Rome. We'll get to that later. And he mentions Alexander and Rufus. Look at Romans 16:13. Hang on to that. Look at Romans 16:13. 16:13. This is Paul writing to the church at Rome. Are you there? Paul says, greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. Is it the same Rufus? Don't know. Could be. And it could be that when Paul spent time in Jerusalem, the mother of Rufus and Alexander were kind to Paul. Could be that when Paul hadn't gotten to Rome yet. So somewhere along in Paul's travels between Jerusalem and Rome, maybe somewhere else, the mother of Rufus had befriended him and had been like a mother to him. So Paul mentions that Rufus could have been the same one whose father carried the cross for Jesus. Even though he was from Cyrene, which is northern Africa, could be that he came and settled down, or he's left his kids there, or his kids moved to Jerusalem, and his wife as well. So we've given all of these links, potential, some of them definite, some of them potential links, in order to do the following: to place Mark in Rome at the same time that Peter was there, and to show that Mark was circulating among the church leaders at that time. He knew Paul, he knew Peter, he knew some other folks. He wasn't the quitter that he had been labeled as back when he left the missionary journey. But he had a lot to contribute. And boy, did he contribute with his gospel, which was the basis for the gospel of Luke and Matthew. That's a pretty big contribution. I mean, I'd like to have my name attached to that, wouldn't you? Okay. Let's move along. All right. One more piece of evidence we'll check on. We talked about the book being anonymous. The title, Gospel of Mark, was attached to the book itself, the writing, the piece of paper, about the middle of the 2nd century. Now, Mark was not a prominent person in the early church. He was there, but he had some dirty laundry attached to his name when he abandoned Mark and Barnabas on this missionary journey. And for at least some time, Paul held that against him. So he's not a prominent person in the early church. His reputation was tarnished. It is most unlikely that the church would have attributed a gospel to him without strong evidence that he wrote it. If there was no strong evidence that Mark had written the gospel, then why would the church go over to a guy whose reputation had been tarnished and say he wrote it? Unless there was strong evidence that in fact he did write it. Well, there is some strong evidence. All this is kind of circumstantial. What if. But there was a historian, a church historian, who cites, let's see if I can write these names up here, because I know you're going to want to know what they are. There was a guy by the name of Eusebius. Eusebius. He was an early church historian. And he quotes a guy by the name of Pius. Now, Pius had written a paper, doctoral thesis maybe, or magazine article. But he had written a paper. And in that paper, he quotes an elder in the church. An elder in the church who knew, let's see, who was it he knew? Oh, who was it he knew? Well, I'll just read it. He quotes a church elder. Here it is. All right. The earliest testimony connects Mark's name to the gospel. It comes from Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor. You know, Ephesus was in Asia Minor. Who wrote, here's the title of that doctoral thesis, The Interpretation of the Lord's Oracles, written sometime between 110 and 130. Now, that doctoral thesis written by Papias is lost. We do not have a copy of it. It burned when they burned Rome or something, I don't know. Anyway, it's lost. But Eusebius heard about it, or had read it, or at that time had a copy of it. We don't have one today, but we do have Eusebius' words. And Eusebius said, and the elder said this also. So Papias, again, is quoting the elder, and Eusebius is quoting Papias. So it's chain here. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, this elder, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord, but however, not in order. And we'll see that when we get into the book. So, this elder, who was someone alive when alive when Mark and Peter were around, is quoted by Papias, and Papias is quoted by Eusebius. For neither did he hear the Lord, talking about Mark, nor did he follow him afterwards. But afterwards, as I said, Peter, who adapted his teachings to the needs of his hearers, but not as though he were drawing up a condensed account of the Lord's order. So the elder is quoting and saying, now Mark didn't follow the Lord. He was too young. He was a teenager when Jesus was crucified. So he didn't follow him. He didn't sit at his feet and learn and learn and learn and learn. But he hung around with Peter. And the elder said that Mark wrote down Peter's stuff. And he did it accurately. See the chain here? It's becoming evidence. For needed to hear, Lord, So then Mark made no mistake in thus recording some things just as he remembered them. The things that Peter had told him. Not the things that he had seen Jesus do. For he took forethought, for one thing, not to omit any of the things he had heard, nor to state them falsely. So now you got a chain which hooks the writings of Mark to Peter. Peter, Mark, this elder, whoever the elder is, to Papias, to Eusebius. And it's Eusebius' words and testimony that we have. Yeah. Okay, you follow that? This will be on the test. Okay, let's see if we can go ahead and finish this up before time's up. Place of writing and target audience. The early church located both places as Rome. Paul's prison letters, Colossians 4:10 and Philemon, that we've already looked at, connect Mark with Rome in the early 60s. 1 Peter 5:13 connects Mark with Peter in Rome in the early 60s. 2 Timothy 4:11 suggests Mark would soon be going to Rome in the late 60s. Comparisons of Mark 15:21 with Romans 10:13 may connect the Gospel of Rome as it is with Rufus, okay? If it's the same Rufus, we talked about that. Tradition indicates that Peter died a martyr in Rome around 64 to 65 AD. A number of Latinisms, that's like Charlottesville-isms, Latinisms in the book favor Rome. Latin was the language spoken in Rome, right? Yes. The writer often explains Jewish customs. You don't need to explain a Jewish custom to a Jew. You do need to explain Jewish customs to a Gentile. Indicating a Gentile audience. And Mark also translated Aramaic words and phrases. Roman citizens generally didn't know Aramaic, and they didn't know Hebrew. So that's why we have that translation, explanation of Jewish customs. And he rarely quoted the Old Testament. Mark rarely quoted the Old Testament. If you're writing to a Jewish audience, you need to quote the Old Testament. But what good does it do to quote the Old Testament if your target audience doesn't know anything about the Old Testament? Doesn't do any good. All right, the date. There's widespread agreement that Mark was written between about 65 and 75. Now that's a big range. That's a 10-year range. But every time I sit down and read something about this, I get a different number. But if Peter died, and this is tradition, folks. It's not fact at all. That Peter died a martyr's death in Rome, 64, 65-ish. So if Peter died, probably wouldn't have the book of Mark, which talks about persevering through suffering. Probably wouldn't have written it early. It probably would have been either during the persecution and suffering or after the persecution and suffering. Because then everybody knows what you're talking about. relationship of Mark to Nero persecution, AD 64 to 65, that's when the persecution was, or to the Jewish revolt against Rome, AD 66 to 70. 66 to 70, the Jews revolted against Rome in Jerusalem. The Roman army came marching in and destroyed everything, wiped it out. That was a big deal. Whether you were living in Jerusalem, it was a really big deal, or even if you were living in Rome and you had some kind of roots to the Jewish faith, as Christians would have had roots to the Jewish faith. That would have been a big deal. It was like the world was coming to an end. You'd already had the Nero and persecution. I'm going to read some of that here in just a minute. What time is it? Ugh. Time's about up. I'll read it next week. And then right on the heels of that, Jerusalem is destroyed. So there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the world connected to Christians, and so they need some encouragement. If Peter had any input in the writing, I mean, he sat down and dictated. A date of earlier than 63 is not likely, since Paul's prison letters, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, were written AD 60 to 62. They don't mention Peter. So Paul is sitting in his house arrest in AD 60 to 62, awaiting hearing before Caesar. And if Peter had been in town, when he greets the people he's writing a letter to, he would have said, and so Peter too, sends you greetings. Okay? He would not have let Peter out if Peter had been in town. Nor is he mentioned in Paul's letter to Rome, AD 56 to 57. Well, most scholars would say, well, tradition says Peter was dead by then. So why do you mention greetings from someone who's dead? All right, so some scholars would bracket them between its early 60s date and the later 60s date. All right, one more page of notes here and then we'll quit. Now, one of my sources, Dr. Brooks, assumes writing in 63 or 64. Dr. Garland, another one of my sources, puts it at the end of the Jewish War. The Jewish War ended in 70 AD or shortly after that. All right, the occasion and purpose. Number one, collect and arrange various individual stories of the deeds and the teachings of Jesus. The church, early church leadership that knew Jesus were dying away. Either they're too old or they're getting executed. They become martyrs. So someone needed to write it down before all of these sources and the truth about Jesus as he walked and talked and preached was going to be lost and much harder to get a hold of. The emphasis on suffering and death, important in the face of the threat of persecution. Certainly there was a lot of that. Being a disciple meant following Jesus in suffering and a mission. We'll see that in Mark's Gospel. Set forth virtues to imitate and vices to avoid. Clarify Jesus' teaching about the future and the impossibility of knowing the timing of the end of the age. When things are really bad, Christians want to say, the end's here. Is the Lord coming again? Maybe, maybe not. So Mark wrote to squish that false assumption. Mark wrote as a pastoral response to the stressful times. Yeah, I'm going to save this reading for later. Jesus is the Son of God. The Holy Spirit, his baptism, says he's the Son of God. The demons and unclean spirits called him the Son of God. At the transfiguration, God revealed that he was the Son of God. And Jesus gave hints in his teachings. Sometimes they were oblique, tangential. And then he confessed it directly in his trial before the Sanhedrin, that he was the Son of God. And finally, the Roman centurion at the crucifixion said, truly, this was the Son of God. All right, time's up. Next week we will begin, after a brief reading from Dr. Garland, about about some things that I didn't get to do today. We'll start writing on Mark, chapter 1, and see what we do. Okay? Yes, sir.
You replaced that, Acts, 1340,
With 1540.
1540.
supposed to be 1540.
Yeah, I think John says it's 1540. Okay? All right. So go ahead if you want to and read the first chapter of Mark. It'll take you all of 7 or 8 minutes. And we'll see you next week. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.